My name is Lucy Michael and I'm spokesperson for Fingal Communities Against Racism. I recently appeared in a documentary by RTE Primetime called The New Nationalists. The piece I believed was intended to expose the far right and show how central racism and fascism are to their agenda. I've been asked by a number of people to explain why I took part in a programme that appeared to platform the far right, and so I wanted to offer a few comments on the programme. I also know that some of the audience found that they were surprised, even shocked by what they saw, and certainly those who were new to it felt that there was balance in the debate. In talking to you today, I want to set out why that balance idea is misplaced and what we can do going forward. I first spoke to the Primetime team on the 3rd of February of this year, ahead of a candlelit vigil in Balbriggan in protest of a meeting of the far right organised by Gemma O'Doherty. From that point I understood the team were doing a piece to expose the far right, and I offered what amounted to several days of assistance to them in locating online footage to demonstrate how central racism and fascism are, and to talk about how to counter and highlight far right arguments without centering them. And from the first time I got involved in discussions about the programme, I believed the community fight back would be one of the central narratives of the programme. Fingal Communities Against Racism was set up in autumn 2019 to directly counter the hate that O'Doherty was inserting into our communities as part of her election campaign, and to address the fear that had taken hold in those trying to counter the far right after the firebombing of TD Martin Kenny's car in the driveway of his home where he was with his wife and young children, after he had made a statement in the Dáil in support of migrants in the Mediterranean, as well as the recent arson attacks in direct provision centres. Our central task we set ourselves was to expose the dangers of the far right without giving them a platform, to highlight the normalisation of racism through their hateful language and approaches, and we took that task seriously. Our campaign literature during the two elections did not even name the far right candidate, but instead tackled the normalisation of the language of hate. The reasons I'm disappointed in the programme is that it's done precisely what we fought so hard not to do, and let me set out what that is. The central arguments of the programme were those of the far right, rather than those which centre racism and fascism as outside of the normal sphere of relations of our society. The false facts and figures presented by far right actors in this programme were not adequately countered. The emotive stories presented by the far right were not matched by the human stories of the impact of the far right mobilising in our communities. Now, RTE might say we have programmes on racism and its impact already, but the impact of the far right mobilising, the way that hate spreads through our language and our approaches to minority groups in our communities, is quite a specific thing, and that didn't get much airtime here. The central terms used in the programme were those of the far right, with a quite inadequate rejection of those terms, something we do, like so many other groups, on a daily basis. The focus on community fight back was cut to a minimum. Representations of community feeling in the programme didn't reflect the success of community fight back in Fingal or elsewhere, either in terms of the Balbriggan meetings or in terms of Gemma O'Doherty's failed election campaigns. Footage used in the demonstrations excluded the very positive feelings around that outright rejection of hate. The presentation of John McGurk underplayed the influence he has through his Breitbart-style website in stirring racial tensions and publishing false information about immigration. In the piece, he was introduced as a right-wing commentator, but as a measured voice in comparison to O'Doherty just before him, when he talked about the so-called genuine concerns on uncontrolled immigration policies. But here's the thing, there are no uncontrolled immigration policies in Ireland. But there was no counter-information offered to McGurk's statement. There were other bits of key information missed which might have established the dangers of these groups more firmly for the audience, like John Waters' platforming of Nigel Farage recently in Dublin, or like the connections between some of these actors and far-right groups abroad, all things we've tried to draw attention to in recent months. The reference to Swedish rape figures directly platformed a key recruitment tool of the far right, which is to create a true-sounding story in another country and use it as a warning of what we might become. There was no counter-information provided for that, nor was the fact of it being a key tool for far-right recruitment highlighted or discussed in the programme. Balbriggan was presented as one of those places of warning, presented from O'Doherty's perspective, not from that of residents who wholeheartedly rejected her description of the town at every general election and by-election campaign and beyond. Even Pat Kenny, one-time Katie Hopkins fan, last year described the success of the town's diversity at the same time as Gemma O'Doherty was running for the by-election in Fingal. Despite featuring recent footage of O'Doherty and Waters at the High Court over COVID, the programme didn't mention the enormously popular online campaigns amongst the Irish public to reject O'Doherty's claim of wide public support. And finally, the title reinforced the very image the far right want in Ireland for themselves. However you feel about nationalism, handing it directly on a plate to the far right is a very dangerous thing to do. In all, the programme failed to do what we believed it was intended to do, which was to expose the dangers of the far right. It centred the far right's anti-immigrant agenda, arguments and terms without adequate context, critique or analysis. It normalised their language, their racism and their violence. It portrayed them as mostly legitimate, if marginal. And it excluded almost every attempt by communities across Ireland to fight this hateful agenda, at very great personal risk in some cases, particularly for minorities and migrants, almost completely. It's clear that producers believe that the question of balance is satisfied, but when it comes to platforming the far right, we can't allow racism and fascism to be just one side of a debate that's presented as a normal part of our society. The platforming that occurred in this programme undermined a lot of the work by groups across this country to de-centre racism and fascism. I'm delighted some of the audience have been given a wake-up call about the nature of these groups, but it doesn't counter the deep concern I share with many others about the ways in which far-right groups have been allowed to position the lives of our neighbours, family and friends as one side of a debate, filled with hateful language, violence and threat, while the Irish public keep rejecting their lies and hate every single day in our own communities. In short, the combination of RTE's legal position and the editorial line eventually taken in this programme suggests that the media in Ireland is incapable of exposing the far right without also providing them precisely the platform they seek. Thank you for listening.